Hello and a very warm welcome to all of you on this Friday morning to What Works, What Doesn't, and Why Insights from Evaluation. Today's discussion will be around IED's evaluation of Operational Priority 5, and we've titled this report, Promoting Rural Development and Food Security. The purpose of this evaluation was to examine how well ADB is prepared and is responsive to support rural development and food security in Asia and the Pacific. And to set a context for this discussion, I'd like to call upon team leader Garrett Kilroy, principal evaluation specialist. He'll make a short presentation which will set the context for today's discussion. So Garrett, it's over to you now.
Well, thanks very much, everyone, and good morning. Thanks for joining our session. I'll just give a short presentation outlining our main findings and messages and recommendations from this evaluation. My name is Garrett Kilroy. I'm the team leader for this evaluation, and I'd firstly like to acknowledge the rest of the IED team who worked on this evaluation, and also the ADB staff both in HQ and in the resident missions who helped us conduct this evaluation. So ADB has been working on rural development and food security for many decades. ADB's original symbol is still visible on our front gate, the cog and the sheaf of wheat. If those of you in HQ, if you go out to podium for your lunch, you can still see it there. And it points to ADB's long support in this area. Indeed, some of our first investments were in irrigation. And if we fast forward to today, these issues are still relevant, with Asia being identified as the area with the most undernourished people in the latest global assessment of food security and nutrition. And in the first chart, you can see that OP5 was designed to provide support through three pillars, and the overall aim was to achieve prosperous rural economies for safe and nutritious food. And I'll discuss our findings for each of the three pillars in the next couple of slides. Our evaluation covered a 6-year period, 2017 to 2022, yielding a portfolio of 33 billion from 244 projects. The first pillar concerns rural development, and it dominated the portfolio by number and volume. And it mostly comprises non-agriculture support for rural infrastructure and services spread across many sectors. In our alignment assessment, we found that the tagging of rural development projects was quite mechanical, with less direct connection to OP5 core objectives. And the lack of a clear definition of rural development and its role in food systems likely contributed to this disconnect. The other two pillars were more directly aligned. The sector breakdown in the pie chart indicates that agriculture and natural resources is the anchor sector for OP5 at 35%, but many other sectors contribute to OP5. And this highlights that the challenge was always going to be how ADB can effectively collaborate across sectors to achieve OP5's thematic objectives. And we found that this is something that was not purposefully considered and implemented at the project or country level. OP5 is also an area of engagement with strong emphasis on co-benefits for gender, environment, and particularly on climate resilience, where the OP5 portfolio is leading the institution on its adaptation finance. There were some gaps in the portfolio. Nutrition and the mitigation side of climate change and agriculture were largely missing from the portfolio, and the role of social protection was not well recognized. The second pillar focused on agriculture value chains, and there was a noticeable uptick with the number of investments almost doubling over the evaluation period. And this was largely driven by the agribusiness team in PSOD. Direct involvement in agriculture value chain on the sovereign side was less common. There is no institutional approach to agriculture value chain in ADB, unlike what we found with other development partners. And in the slide, we mapped ADB's value chain investments against the typology developed by researchers at Cornell University. Most of ADB's efforts were on targeting the larger, more specialized firms with links to global value chains and less on the traditional transitional farms and firms. An institutional approach is needed like this for ADB to map the entry points for sovereign and non-sovereign, and also to help foster cross-sectoral cooperation. Finally, the third pillar of OP5 was on food security, which was not well defined in the plan. And in fact, when we look at the portfolio of this pillar, it mostly focuses on agricultural production, whereas food security is a higher level objective sitting above these efforts. In the absence of a clear definition, for this evaluation, we adopted FAO's 4 dimensions of food security: utilization, accessibility, stability, and availability. And we mapped the portfolio using their results frameworks, their DMFs. And we found that about half of the portfolio supported at least one of the 4 dimensions. The figure shows that ADB support is greatest for availability. That's the supply side, with a focus on agricultural productivity, and less so for utilization, which covers consumption and nutrition issues. Support for nutrition at ADB is mainly through social protection, and this is something that was not well recognized by the OP5 tagging approach. But overall, for food security, we found that all 3 pillars actually contribute to varying degrees to these 4 dimensions. But ADB lacks a robust mapping and tracking system for food security, so that we can learn lessons from our investments and design future investments. We also found that partnerships will be key to addressing some of the weaker areas like nutrition and also knowledge gaps, such as better tracking of food security. And maybe one recent example is the Rome-based UN agencies have just published their 2024 report on food security and nutrition. And that includes a whole chapter on guidance for food security finance definitions and tracking, which I think would be useful for ADB. So finally, on our recommendations, we had 4 recommendations which ADB management has accepted. And overall, the evaluation found that rural development and food security continues to be a very relevant area of engagement for ADB. It builds on ADB's long experience in this area. It's leveraging very important co-benefits on climate, gender, and environment. And it's supported by an improved performance in recent years in the agriculture sector. The AFNR sector has performed quite well in recent years. However, our evaluation found that to deliver effective support and meet its ambition on food security and rural development, ADB needs to reposition itself towards resilient and sustainable agri-food systems. And this will involve clarifying its objectives, implementing one ADB approaches across sectors, articulating an institutional approach to agricultural value chains, increasing integration with the private sector, and strengthening the monitoring and reporting of results with a more robust food security finance tracking system. So thank you for your attention. The QR code there will bring you to the landing page of our report, the management response, and the deck chair summary. And I'll hand it back to Saleha.
Thank you very much, Garrett. And now it's time for From the Frontlines. As many of you might know, From the Frontlines is a video series which we play in the middle of What Works. And this actually showcases reactions to the evaluation report from the resident missions. Let's hear what the Thailand resident mission has to say about this evaluation.
The IED report on Operational Priority 5, promoting rural development and food security, is very timely in the sense that it alerts us to the need to invest more and focus better to enhance food security in Asia and the Pacific. It aligns with the recently released report, the State of Food Security and Nutrition Report for 2024, which also states that the world is still far off track and investments have been uneven and insufficient. I fully agree with the recommendations of the IED report, especially recommendations 1, 3, and 4. For example, recommendation 3 stresses the need for articulating an institutional approach on agricultural value chains. Although we have made some progress, The agricultural value chain investments were only $1.9 billion out of $33.1 billion over 6 years. We have good examples from the Greater Mekong sub-region, such as the GMS Climate-Friendly Agribusiness Value Chain Sector Project in Cambodia, Laos, PDR, and Myanmar, as well as the GMS Cross-Border Livestock Health and Value Chain Project in Cambodia and Laos, PDR. Perhaps it is time to replicate such successes in other regions as well to enhance our investments in agricultural value chains.
All right, so now it's time for me to introduce you to the panelists. We have with us today AED Lisa Wright, Cathy Marsh, Deputy Director General PSOD, Yasmin Siddiqi, Director Agriculture, Food, Nature and Rural Development, Sector Groups, and Sean Yi, Principal Water Resources Specialist, Sector Group 2. And today's discussion will be moderated by DG IED Manny Jimenez. So Manny, it's over to you now.
Thanks very much, Saleha. Good morning, everybody. It's great to see everybody on this Friday morning here in Manila and indeed online for everyone. It's been a while since we've all had these very many Zoom meetings as a regular basis. So all of us are just trying to get reaccustomed to the technology. So forgive us if there are we pushed the wrong buttons and mute people or anything else. But we're looking forward to this discussion. But the upside of this is that we're able to have people here who are dialing in from around the globe and are able to bring their expertise. And we're very pleased that we have a diverse panel in which we will be hearing from several people who really can address this issue that of how ADB looks forward to addressing this operational priority on rural development and food security, given the evaluation in the past. So we're hoping to have a conversation that is going to be more forward-looking about how ADB can take up these challenges. And then we'll have a question and answer from all of you online, given the number of people. If you could put your questions to the on the chat, that would help us manage the conversation. So I'll start off with asking a leading question, given the different perspectives of our panelists, and ask them just in about 3 or 4 minutes or so, no more, because we want this to be a conversation on their reflections. Yasmin, I hope that the internet links are stable for you over in India, but thank you very much for joining us. Yasmin, as the director of AFNR in the sectors group, you're in a great position to address the challenge that the evaluation found on if there's all of these operational priorities are in fact cross-sectoral and thematic. And if you could reflect based on where you sit in the sectors group of how ADB should ensure that the solutions that we provide to our clients reflect the strengths across the different disciplines and sectoral groups that we have to give the very best to them. So over to you, Yasmin.
Thank you so much, Manny and colleagues. Thanks to Saleha. Thanks for the invitation to this panel. I believe from the evaluation and sort of looking ahead, maybe 4 main points and very much linked to the norm and the operational shift in response to the region's needs. I'd say firstly, definitely based on the experiences that we have, we can see that there's tremendous value in the upstream working, and what we're really doing looking forward now is coming in much earlier on some of the key areas of upstream risk assessments, firstly with the climate change context and coming in with climate risk assessments upstream, so that we're using a risk-based approach to deliver on solutions for the region, rather than what I would call our traditional or more conventional approach, where we looked at a project from a project context and then work the climate resilience into that project approach. Here with the upstream risk assessment, at least what we're identifying are what are the key risks to the sector and how could an investment respond to those risks, number one. Number two, similarly, with our natural capital colleagues, and we have Sean on the call as well, it's really looking at the value of nature. And I'm sure Sean will share a few insights on that, but it's looking at natural capital assessments as well. And by valuing nature, ecosystems, how any interventions that we're making could have implications on that, and how do we build in the value of nature. Number two, Manny, and I think it's a really important area for ADB to go back into and strengthen across the board, is policies and institutions. And we have good experience just recently working on countries such as Bangladesh, Pakistan, Uzbekistan, to name a few, where policy-based lending has a tremendous value on establishing the environment or the enabling environment for investments. Lastly, I'd like to also add that the value addition in agriculture, so not just focusing on production, but looking at value addition through value chain operators, farmer producer organizations, and capital enhancement of key commodities is another key area where we can see ADB adding value. So perhaps I'll stop there and allow other colleagues to give their insights. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot, Yasmin, and terrific points that you raised. Very clear, and the need to work upstream and on the policy issues. And I'm so glad that you also gave a very good segue to Sean on natural capital, because I want to turn to him next. And given his own background, both professionally in different sectors, but also the issue of natural capital and how that really is an issue that is central to rural development and food security, but also for environmental trying to mitigate the downsides environmentally on these issues. And so, Sean, given your extensive experience in this area, but also your country experience in some countries, I was wondering if you could reflect on some of the issues that Yasmin raised earlier on taking the example of perhaps natural capital on these co-benefits and how ADB is being more solutions oriented as we try to tackle these wicked problems on food security and rural development.
Thanks, Manny. And I think can you hear me clearly? Basically, as just to build on Yasmin's points, a lot of the work that we're doing in the sector's office, a lot of this stuff can't be seen in individual silo contexts, and this is reflected in none more so than our work in natural capital. A lot of our work is based on a lot of seminal, I would say, and pioneering work in ADB through our programmatic work in the PRC, and in the PRC of the many decades, we've developed a very strong what we would say, a landscape approach, and landscape in the full sense of the word, landscape in terms of livelihoods, landscape in terms of nature, landscape in terms of food security, which we'll get into, I'm sure, later in the conversation. Taking this broad and holistic approach from source to sea, we started off in the Yangtze River. We've shifted from that to the Yellow River. What that is taking a approach where it looks at the needs of the river basin as a system. We look at in the Yellow River, which is, I guess, the next iteration of our programmatic work. We're looking at it in terms of a sophisticated ecological corridor. So, these are connectivity areas of connectivity where we connect nature, we connect the climate, food, nature nexus. Nature underpins all of our agricultural and livelihood activities in a lot of our rural development activities, and this is none more so reflected than the investments we've done in China. We look at the co-benefits from a range of different viewpoints. We look at it in terms of, firstly, the nuts and bolts of our rural development and initial engagements through our water and sanitation work, improving agricultural irrigation, the basics. But then what takes it the next step further in our sophisticated sort of a multi-sectoral work in China is in the PRC is that we now build a broader holistic picture of what do all these things in terms of a synergistic approach. So we're not just looking in terms of a sectoral, but we're looking at, okay, we've got environmental benefits by improving wastewater sewage sort of systems. Then we've got a livelihood component because we have improved living environment. So, and this overlays very nicely with the government's programs on the master planning for these river basins. So in this sense, the DMC that we're working with, they're leading in terms of taking this institutional wide approach. And what we're doing is working with the client to leverage these programs and policies, bringing in best practices. So what we're really doing is just helping bring about those best practices, but really we've been led by client demand. And this really shows a very forward-looking approach to understanding the linkages. And later on, we can get into the new projects that we're doing that's now taking this to the next level. So not just looking at green development and ecotourism, which is a picture of a lot of a component for most of our projects, but now we're looking at regional flyways. So not just a river, but we're looking at the entire region where we're connecting migratory bird flyways against the backdrop of nature. So wetlands, lakes, and river systems that connect across the basin. So let me just stop there, but it just gives a nice context to where we go in terms of building the foundation for agriculture and food security as the focus of OP5 implies. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sean, because you really laid out I think, to my mind, a very innovative way of looking at wicked development issues and ensuring that we take this holistic approach in which I really believe that the livelihoods of people depends on the livelihood of the environment, whether it's built or not. And I think that perspective is really important. And it must be a huge challenge because I know the MDBs had not always looked at it this way, but I want to get back to that. Now I want to turn to another aspect of how this particular issue does require integrated solutions. And that's the make sure that we are integrated on the sovereign and non-sovereign side. And Cathy, we're so happy to have you here from PSOD because the evaluation found that, in fact, agricultural value chain investments almost doubled over the period, largely driven by some of the innovations that your department has done. How can ADB build up on this success to further scale up our investments and really make sure that, in effect, the smallholder farmers that we're trying to address, those who are living under the flyways that Sean talked about, are in fact benefiting?
Yeah, thank you, Manny. And I first of all, thank you to you and your team for this evaluation and and the process in it. We all thought it was very positive and thank you for your recognition of the inputs from our team in PSOD as well as part of that. And you're right. I mean, to date, PSOD, we've invested over $1 billion across about 40 plus investments in 21 of our DMCs, in the agribusiness space. But we've only scratched the surface with what we've done thus far, and there's a huge amount of additional investment that's needed across Asia to meet consumer demand over the next 10 years. We do see a lot of opportunities across a wide range of subsectors, including retail and food processing, inputs in the sense of seeds, fertilizers, and so on, as well as livestock, fisheries, agro, forestry, logistics, and warehousing. And we have a focus to help us build on the progress that we've made so far, partly by looking to repeat business with well-reputed existing clients like Ecom and Olam and Louis Dreyfus, as well as, we've talked about, climate. We've touched on climate so far in this conversation, but, we're also, we have an eye on that as well to try and have a focus on climate finance transactions. And on top of that, adding new clients in active markets, as well as exploring co-financing with other IFIs in frontier markets and potential equity opportunities. In terms of integration of the smallholder farmers themselves, and we probably all know the stats on that. The majority of smallholder farmers globally are found in Asia. What we do in PSOD, the team focuses on projects that integrate the small farmers into the supply chain for that particular project. And we view that as a key screening criteria for the transactions that we look at. And what that farmer integration does, it helps to organize farmers to build their capacity, and it effectively channels market requirements as to quality and sustainable practices back to the farmers themselves. So it creates this sort of feedback loop that then feeds into the product itself that is supplied by those smallholder farmers. And how we often achieve that also is by deploying TA funding to support farmer integration initiatives into that overall supply chain, and to build farmer capacity in climate resilience and sustainable practices, as well as promoting women farmers in corporate supply chains as well, because that's an important focus of our work also. So I hope that's helpful, and I'll pause here for now. Thank you.
Oh, that's great, Cathy. Thank you. And I want to get back to the issues that you raised, because after all, smallholder farmers are probably the bulk of the most vulnerable as well in many of our countries, and the issues that you raised on how private investment can help them reminds me that things that Yasmin mentioned earlier about how it is that should also be supported on the policy side, and I want to get back to that a little later on. But before we do that, I'm going to turn to Lisa from your point of view at the board. And you've heard the discussion here about how rural development and food security really needs to be addressed in the context of some of the more global issues that the world is confronting, especially on climate change. We've all heard the stats, for example, and how a lot of the methane that is produced in the world comes from rice production and livestock production in the rural areas. And I know that globally, there's been this sense that, look, we can't do this alone. We have to work in partnerships with others. Given your experience, both here in the ADB at the board, but also from a major bilateral point of view, how and with whom might ADB partner to better complement its own comparative advantage to address these issues?
Thank you, Manny. I'm always delighted to talk about the power of partnerships. It's a hallmark of ADB's work, and I think our value proposition to the region, and very important part of working in this sector. As you alluded to, I think partnerships and donor coordination on these really big challenges are key to ensuring development effectiveness, and really critical. Partnerships are really critical to amplifying the benefits of our work, to be able to get reach and scale. Also, I think, as Cathy alluded to, sharing some of the risks, but also the transaction costs of the work we do. the evaluation did clearly tell us that donor coordination and our sort of partnership work in the sector, there's certainly room for improvement. It tends often to be ad hoc and not as systematic as it probably could be and should be. So, that means we've got overlaps, we've got gaps in investment, and most importantly, we've got lost opportunities. So I also think it's important to remember that I think leadership, partnership, and collaboration in this space, I think, comes in many shapes and forms. So, for example, in many of our partner countries, our DMCs, particularly in the Pacific, I know, the capacity of departments of agriculture is often quite low. And the departments of agriculture, which often include, natural resources and fisheries as well, they often struggle to influence other key departments in the sort of government ecosystem. And that includes departments of finance and treasury who hold the purse strings and are often very influential in government systems. But I think ADB is in a really good sort of lead partnership position there because we have exceptionally good relationships with the departments of finance and treasury through our governors and our shareholder arrangements. So it really places us very well to be able to leverage those relationships on behalf of other departments, to be able to improve coordination, to be able to build effectiveness. I mean, sometimes even towards getting better resources for departments of agriculture. So thinking about ADB, in a convening role and as a sort of cross-donor, cross-coordination role, I think is a very powerful one. The second sort of partnership area, I think, is private sector, and Cathy's already spoken to that, and I'm sure there'll be a bigger conversation about that. One of the key takeaways, again, from the evaluation is that the agriculture and food sectors are inherently private sector endeavours. The vast majority of the agribusiness is profile. The SMEs are private sector and SME focused. And so there are very significant co-benefits of working with the private sector that I think, as Cathy alluded to, we've only just begun that journey and there are enormous opportunities. I've also had a lot of experience working with multilaterals and other global partners in this space when I worked in the Australian government. So I worked very closely for many years with CGIR, so the Consortium for International Agricultural Research Centres. Those centres are all over the world and focus on particular areas of the sector, from rice to water to food security policy to dry land cropping. So enormous networks, partnerships, expertise, experience that we can draw on. I know we work closely with a number of them, including IRI, the Rice Research Centre. So just again, we can't do all of this on our own, and we don't have expertise in every element and part subsector. So drawing on that expertise where it is, and particularly the research and development expertise in those centres, I think is really critical. Again, in the multilateral sector, working with other MDBs, as I've already said, I think is really important. Our audience will be keenly aware there's been a very big call on ADB and all MDBs to work better together as a system. And I think that's going to be that is and will continue to be very true of this sector, which for all the MDBs, this sector, food security, is a flagship area of work and a very big profile piece in the SDGs. So working together and effectively on that, I think is really important. And I think COVID spotlighted the power of MDBs to be able to work effectively in this space and mitigate and remediate some of the impacts COVID had on food security and food value chains. And then finally, NGOs and community groups. So working with partners from the big end of the NGO world, but all the way through to, farmer groups, smallholder farmers, beneficiaries, producer and community groups. So thinking down in our downstream end of our work about working with those partnerships effectively, I think that speaks to us being client-centric and client-focused, which as part of our Strategy 2030 and our NOM is our shift, a paradigm shift in the way we're working. It also speaks to, I think, the accountability mechanism as the policy piece. So thinking about who we're accountable to and who we need to be working with and partnering with, from the get-go, from the design and early development phases through to, the implementation and the tracking and monitoring stage. And I think that's probably enough on partnerships from me at this stage.
Terrific. That's terrific. In fact, you raised a number of issues, each of which will deserve their own what works sessions, Lisa, especially on which we might want to get back to. Reminding us, thank you, for that partnerships is not just with other MDBs or with governments, but with other research institutions like CGIAR, other organizations, and CSOs. Which is an excellent point. But I want to take up your other point, which really touches on some of the issues that were raised earlier. And that's our comparative advantage as an institution in making the link between the sector departments and the finance and treasury ministries. That is, we can work upstream in a better way. And secondly, what you mentioned about our sovereign and non-sovereign integration. And I want to go back to both Yasmin and to Sean on your reflections on some of the issues that Cathy raised, that in order to build on our investments, including on agricultural value chains, we need to have the right policy environment. And I know, Yasmin, let's start with you. You raised the question of moving upstream. I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit more on that, on how we make sure that as we do that, we leverage both our sovereign and non-sovereign sides in a most constructive way.
Great, thank you, Emmanuel. It was great to listen to all of our speakers and the wealth of knowledge they've brought to this call, and in a way how we're all, as I hear it, singing from the same hymn sheet, because here we can see all the jigsaw pieces fitting together. Just on your specific question, I'd like to raise 3 points. Firstly, and I think definitely, I allude back to the norm and this opportunity for us to really start working much more collaboratively across sectors, themes, with private sector teams, and also with parts of the bank, which I would call sort of the unknown players that we haven't worked with more overtly, bringing them into the arena as well. And I allude to our colleagues from the finance teams and colleagues who may be sitting further out there in the Treasury Department as well, where we need to go for guidance. So I think that the game players have changed. I believe the convening, I wouldn't want to say the word power, but let's say the convening opportunity that we had from the sector side is far greater, in that we can pull in now a lot more players. And here I'd just like to give reference to an example, which was the Blue Economy event that we held in Bangladesh, which was our starting point of raising awareness in Bangladesh around what is the blue economy. I have to say, for me as well, an eye-opening opportunity to bring in colleagues from as far as Treasury, where we had Maria sharing with us insights on blue bonds, topics which maybe from the sector side we haven't historically discussed or haven't had the opportunity to go into those type of areas. But here we have a client who is really keen to mobilize the force of their blue economy, which means for us, the groundwork that we need to do in the sector really needs to pull in colleagues from far afield. We brought in colleagues working on finance and policy-based lending in Indonesia and looking at financing hubs. And very similar to what AD Lisa mentioned, bringing in partners and the power of partnerships, recognizing that it's not just ADB alone that can deliver on this. So I see that there's that need to bring in much more in terms of the players at the table as well. Secondly, on what we have been working on with colleagues such as Martin Lemoyne from the private sector team is the joint pipeline planning upstream. So again, going much further upstream to see where are some of those deals which have the catalytic effect either way. And Cathy, I think you alluded to some of those key players again from the private sector side. Just as an example, we worked in Uzbekistan with Endorama, where we engaged with Endorama from the sovereign side, listening to their work and them listening to our work with the Ministry of Water Resources on production gains in cotton. And then I believe it's Martin and the team working then with Endorama much more on a non-sovereign deal to really strengthen the work that we've done together. So Endorama working on the non-sovereign side, but being a knowledge player for us and partnering with us to understand how do sovereign, non-sovereign converge around production and then the value chain. Thirdly, Manny, I do think this is important, and it's an area where I'd like to sort of also raise from our side, from the sovereign side, that terminology of bilingual staffing that we've used in the past for climate change, and having staff who are bilingual on the climate agenda and being able to weave that into the sovereign side. I do believe it's important equally for staff to be bilingual around the private sector, non-sovereign aspects of our work, to know where you can then tap into the private sector colleagues and pull them in on your missions and in some of the work you're doing. And here I'd just like to illustrate, I've just been in the field earlier in the week in Maharashtra, where we have an excellent project on the Maharashtra Agribusiness Network, otherwise known as the Magnet Project, where we're working with farmer producer organizations and value chain operators. Not so much on the production side, but on the value chain. And there you can see with cold storage and the cold chain, where private sector starts to play a role around food processors and export orientation. So there are key elements of bringing in private sector all the way from the upstream side into the project side. Thank you.
Great. No, thanks very much, Yasmin. And your challenge for all of us to be at least bilingual is something I always want to turn to both Sean and Cathy to, because in fact, from your perspective, it's not just bilingualism that we need, it's multilingualism, or being polyglots, because it's not just a sovereign and non-sovereign, but then we have to bring in environment and now natural capital. Sean, let me turn to you first, then I'll turn to Cathy on whether you think how we develop those skills of multilingualism in our approach, and especially Sean, to you on bringing in not just sovereign and non-sovereign, but the environmental side.
Yeah, thanks, Manny. And just continuing on the same vein that Yasmin has set forward, a lot of the work that we look at in terms of putting on a natural capital lens, a lot of it it's about demystifying and trying to bring people onto the same plane. Because when we talk about natural capital, it can be in everything, and it can be in a lot of things to different people. So we ground it around our project investments, around the projects in the countries that have demonstrable, successes, I guess you could say. And again, the model work that we've done in the flagship Yangtze and Yellow River Basin work is, there's probably three areas that come to mind. So one, we do need to work upstream. That's aside. The first one and foremost for a lot of our work in UMICs like PRC is really about institutional strengthening. Institutional strengthening lays the foundation for a lot of the policy reforms that are needed to affect and facilitate those outcomes that we're trying to achieve. So in this case, if it's meeting biodiversity framework goals or environmental targets or food security, all of it is underpinned by country-specific institutional frameworks. In China, in the PRC, we've been very proud to be able to be at the timely sort of, juncture where we supported the landmark Yangtze River Protection Law. This is the first time there's a significant legislation that's focused on the conservation, but also the development of a single river basin. In this case, the largest river basin system in China and in Asia, and the third largest river system worldwide, home to hundreds of millions of people. And if you look at the industries and the jobs, it really is fundamental. And I think again, it's forward thinking from the DMC side, from China's side, from the PRC side, that they saw that if they didn't do anything, then this balancing of economic development and environmental conservation is never going to be achieved. And they wouldn't be able to achieve those economic gains without addressing the fundamentals. The next thing is looking at once you've got the institution set up, it's about looking at what are the sort of arrangements that we can sort of facilitate sort of private sector or business sector investment. We started this off with our work in the natural capital space, and in fact, it was a prelude to that was the eco compensation sort of mechanism that China has pioneered. And what we did is we worked with them to develop and improve on that mechanism. And what does this mechanism basically mean? It's about trying to understand incentives. Incentives drive everything. So in terms of agricultural productivity, willingness or not to pollute, incentives to do things better, it all comes down to these incentives. And eco compensation provides a nice framework to provide those incentives for upstream and downstream relationships. And we've developed that further and are piloting that now with natural capital accounting to try to put values to some of those ecosystem services and understand the contribution from nature to economic development outcomes. And the last point I'd like to mention is that it's about then scaling the experiences in countries, not necessarily PRC, but we've got also experiences in other countries. It's about scaling them fit for purpose in the context of other countries. So Bangladesh is a nice case in point. They visited the PRC earlier this year, a few months ago, and they wanted to understand how they go about managing a river basin because they've got 900 over rivers, 800 or 900 rivers. So this is a country that's trying to understand what's best practice, what works, and what didn't work. And so, that has now led to, I guess, kickstart of a program of river basin resilience and related sort of programmatic investments that are now starting to show, real results. So I guess these are the different areas that I would say is important, and it's all fundamentally underpinned by institutional strengthening and knowledge sharing.
Great,
So
and
let
I
me stop there,
appreciate
Sharon.
you're bringing specific examples on each of those points. Cathy, if I might turn to you on this issue of the need for our staff to think out of their own little boxes. And I wonder if you could reflect, and I don't know if you think I'm putting you on the spot on this, on whether or not our private sector staff especially, they need to ensure that it's not just the financial returns, but these other outcomes that are ultimately we're concerned about. We've talked about climate change and environment. We haven't really talked about also nutrition outcomes, because in the end, we want ag value chains because we want to make sure that the food at the end actually addresses food security as countries see it. I was wondering if you could reflect on how we ensure that our private sector staff are really taking on board some of these broader issues in their work.
Sure. No, thank you, Manny. Manny, I think that you summarized it really well when you talked about multilingualism, right? We talk a lot about bilingualism, but ultimately, I completely agree with you. We don't mean that. We mean multilingualism, but what do we then mean by that phrase as well? Because nobody with the best will in the world can be multilingual in everything that is needed here. And so I think that what we probably mean by phrases such as that is understanding and awareness, while also I think it's really important that we continue to recognize the key role that specialism plays as well. In all of these conversations. And so, from an individual staff perspective, I think that, what does that come down to? It comes down to, understanding that there are more dimensions involved than, your particular lane, and, having a general understanding of what those other dimensions are, while also realizing that with the best will in the world, you will never, as the individual staff, have the true expertise in every single aspect. And, you know, so therefore that speciality knowledge is also required, you know, in those areas. And that, I think, is, you know, fundamentally what we all mean by these phrases, and, you know, what we are all ultimately trying to achieve as well, which, you know, it will take time. Obviously, you know, everything like this will always take time, and, you know, we need to recognize that as well. But, you know, in terms of your question as to, you know, are the folk in PSOD, you know, understanding these broader dimensions? I mean, I think the resounding answer to that, from my perspective at least, is, you know, yes, absolutely. And, you know, we in PSOD, we've sort of pioneered this ex ante development effectiveness approach, for example, in each of our transactions. You know, from the very initial consideration of a transaction, you know, by PSOD management, those, you know, those broader outcomes form a cornerstone of, you know, what we look at when we, you know, do our initial evaluation of whether we should or should not proceed with a particular, you know, potential investment. And, you know, again, that's a journey. All of these things are journeys, but, you know, I think that we are getting better and better at that, because, you know, it's not simply, you know, the financial outcome, it's the development outcome. And, you know, what does that mean? It means all sorts of things, including climate, including gender. You know, there are so many different threads that we try to pull together in, you know, genuinely in every investment, you know, that we look at. I mean, I think in the context of the agri space, which, you know, is obviously our focus today, the private sector has an absolutely critical role to play. I think, you know, private sector generally is absolutely central to solving food security challenge, and introducing new technologies, you know, innovation in technological innovation to try and make food systems, you know, more productive and resilient. And this actually comes back to a point that Lisa touched on, you know, in terms of partnerships and, you know, IRI and organizations, you know, of similar organizations. And I think this comes back to this multilingualism approach as well, because it's really important for everyone to appreciate that, you know, the private sector does super interesting technological innovation. But they do that for profit. They don't do it, you know, for the good of whatever. They do it for profit. And so it's trying to find those ways to reconcile the fundamentals of what private sector is actually about, you know, with the wider overarching, you know, development goals for all of us. So, you know, which is why we come to work every day, ultimately.
Great. No, thanks, Cathy. There are a couple of questions on the chat. One good comment, which is just not really a question, but a comment to everyone, that really great to see the strong focus on food security and environment nexus. And I was wondering if I could also try to ask, well, first, Lisa and Yasmin, on your quick reflections on the issue, the other question that was raised, which is on how we make sure we incorporate nutrition outcomes in our investments that Cathy alluded to, especially because some of the nutrition issues is not just supply side, but demand side. How do we make sure that people are in fact consuming, are able to consume the right foods? So first, Lisa, I wonder if you could reflect on that based on perhaps your the knowledge that you've gained dealing with CGIAR, IFPRI, and others on this. And I'll turn to Yasmin.
Very good question. And I think I raised it in our discussions with IED when we were looking at this evaluation, was the importance of being nutrition sensitive in our approach across the sector, which, may have been lost in recent years. So let's bring it back to the fore. And I think it does go to the issue of, not just the challenges we're facing, the impact of climate change and environmental effects on the sector, but also to the way we produce our food and the way we consume it and what we consume, I think is really critical. Very quick example of sort of some work I've done previously before coming to ADB with the Australian government on a small innovation project with a lot of partners in the Pacific called the Pacific Island Food Revolution, where we basically put together a reality TV program, which was shown throughout the region and in Australia, supported by social media and a whole lot of outreach using mobile technology to reach as many people as possible. But it was basically a cook-off show with each Pacific Island country competing against each other. But the focus was on bringing men into the kitchen, bringing people into the kitchen, cooking local food and thinking about growing local food as smallholders and in their own home gardens in a way that they used to have but had stopped doing, and thinking about healthy diets and making behavioural changes to the way people thought about food and purchased food, and what were they expecting to see in markets to be able to drive that change. So a little bit at the sort of innovation end, but I think it does highlight the importance of food and nutrition. And of course, in the Pacific in particular, again, as an example, it was a way of, in a very accessible and I think friendly way, trying to tackle the very significant issue of non-communicable diseases in the region, diabetes, heart disease and obesity, in a way by tackling, some of the challenges at its source. But I will hand to Yasmin.
No, thank you. Thank you, Lisa. And I'm going to look for that. Perhaps if you have a link on YouTube, it certainly would be better than some of the things I watch. But Yasmin, very quickly over to you on this issue on nutrition and demand side.
Thanks, Manny. And I mean, it's great opportunities for us on the operation side because, on the one hand, you have the ground level realities of working with your beneficiary communities, your stakeholders, and really listening to the needs that they have and understanding the challenges they're facing. And I believe just even in terms of, as we're alluding to, the climate context, very much linking in with the work we're doing with gender teams, particularly around the heat stress initiative and the implications and impacts and intersectionality between heat, gender, and climate, and looking at how those impact not just on crop production and the requirements we'll have to better understand what we do in terms of agronomic practices and implications on soil health at the production side, but all the way through to health implications, particularly around gender and impacts of climate. So I think there's that aspect that we do need to consider when we're working on project preparation and on the upstream side on what type of results we want to deliver. But excitingly, I must say that with the evolution of our work in the sector as well, and moving into partnerships and really bringing nutrition security in under the food systems approach, which is the step forward we've made from the sector side, sort of going beyond that food security of accessibility, affordability, but now into the full systems approach. So a lot of what Sean has been sharing and colleagues have been sharing, nutrition is really one of our thrust areas as we look ahead for our sector's work across the region. And here I'd just like to highlight that we're already engaging with the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition. In fact, we had a meeting here yesterday with GAIN. We're listening to what other players are doing in terms of what we could learn and scale up in our country programming and initiatives, and even looking at some of the aspects around what types of crops, what types of areas do we need to focus on. And here, as an example, millets, and bringing back some of those varieties of cropping which really add nutrition. And lastly, Manny, just touching upon that point that AD Lisa made, it's the digital aspects as well, the solutions and innovations, and working with now Chicago University on looking at how digital solutions, soil health and monitoring can really add value I'll stop there, Manny, in the interest
Thank
of
you,
time.
Yasmin. And unfortunately, this is we have come to the end of the time, and this is such a fascinating conversation. And I just want to thank all of you for the ideas that you've brought. You've raised many more questions than we're able to answer, but I do think that some certain themes have come out very strongly. And I think that the solutions going forward need to make sure that we work much more closely together rather than in narrow project teams. And we need to work across a very, very challenging, but I think doable task. They need to work upstream on systems and not just look at whether it be natural or person-made, but really systems and policy issues. And really the need to make sure that we have open minds. And even if we can't speak different languages, that we at least know how to understand people and bring in the right ways to interpret. So please join me in giving our panel a great virtual hand of applause for a very fascinating conversation. Over to you, Saleha.
Thank you, Lisa, Cathy, Yasmin, and Sean. And thank you, audiences, for joining us today. That's it for now, but do not forget to actually fill the form, the feedback form that will follow this event. It'll just make us work on what works and make it better and better as we go forward. Thank you very much for now. Bye-bye.